In a town where a locked door was a sign of rudeness, Carol Sue Klaber grew up in the kind of safety that only exists in memories now. But the answer to what happened to her was sitting just 1.5 miles from her front door. For 46 years, nobody knew that. Fort Wright, Kentucky. 1976. 4,500 people, quiet streets, the Ohio River glittering just a few miles east. Fort Wright sat close enough to Cincinnati to feel connected to the world, but small enough that strangers were noticed. Kids rode bikes until dark. Parents didn't check their watches. This was the kind of town that made you believe nothing bad could reach you here. It was wrong about that. Carol Sue Klaber was born November 28, 1959, 16 years old in the summer of 1976, about to begin her senior year at Dixie Heights High School. When Carol was 8 years old, her piano teacher, Hattie Schatzman, chose her, out of every student she taught, to perform at the Ohio Music Teachers Association, not in a classroom, not at a school recital, at the Taft Museum, a real stage, a real audience. Carol performed there twice. She added violin, then guitar. By high school, she was playing in the string ensemble, and the people around her had stopped seeing her as a student and started seeing her as a future. But talent was never the most important thing about Carol. At 16, on her own time, she volunteered at St. Charles Nursing Home. No school requirement, no extra credit. She chose to spend part of her free time sitting with elderly people who simply needed someone there. Her brother Thomas would later describe her as someone who felt things deeply, who noticed people others walked past. She was funny too, not performed funny, naturally funny. The kind of person who said one thing and made a room laugh without even trying. Her life had already held loss. Her father, Daniel Henry Clayber, died in 1970. Carol was 10 years old. Her mother, Betty Jane, had since remarried, and the family had done what families do. They kept going. They rebuilt around the empty space. Carol made that easier. She always made things easier. June 4th, 1976, a Thursday evening. Carol spent part of that afternoon the way she spent most summer afternoons, on her bike, moving through the neighborhood, ending up at Daville Park in western Covington. It was one of her regular spots. In 1976, if you wanted to find your friends, you went to the park. You showed up. Carol always showed up. She talked to people. That was never a flaw. That was just who she was. At some point in that park, she crossed paths with a young man. A neighbor would later describe what they saw. Tall, around 6 feet, slim build, sandy blonde hair. A light-colored Chevrolet Monte Carlo parked nearby. Whatever passed between them in that park, whatever conversation, whatever recognition, whatever moment of connection, it was enough. Carol's bike went into the trunk of his car. He drove her home. She went inside, put the bike away. And then she came back out. She had changed clothes, an off-white blouse, dress pants. She had dinner plans that evening. Zeno's Restaurant, Hyde Park, Cincinnati, and she was dressed for it now. She walked back to that car she got in, and here is the question that has no clean answer, even now. Carol was not naive. She was not reckless. She was a responsible, independent girl who her family trusted completely. So why did she get back into that car? Did she know him from somewhere? The same school district, maybe? A familiar face from the neighborhood? Had the conversation in the park simply been warm enough, easy enough, safe feeling enough that she made a decision that felt completely reasonable in that moment? We don't know, and that uncertainty is not a small thing, because it means anyone could have made that same choice. On that same evening, in that same town. Don't try to solve it yet, just hold it. Her family was not worried when she didn't come home that night. That was Carol, independent. She sometimes stayed with friends without giving a full itinerary. Nobody panicked. Nobody called anyone. The house settled into its normal evening quiet. The streetlights of Fort Wright came on one by one. Somewhere, not far, just 1.5 miles from her own front door, the night had already turned cold for Carol. The next morning, June 5th, 1976, Dr. Gaines Huey left his house early for the drive to work. He was a dentist in Walton, 17 miles south of Fort Wright, a routine commute down Chambers Road, a quiet rural stretch through southern Boone County, trees on both sides, a still morning, then something at the edge of the road. Next to a culvert, a concrete drainage pipe built into the shoulder. Something was there that had no reason to be there. Dr. Huey slowed. He pulled over. He stepped out into the morning air. And Carol Sue Klaber's story, the part the world would spend the next 46 years trying to understand, began right there on the cold shoulder of Chambers Road, 17 miles from home, 1.5 miles from the answer. She was lying beside the culvert, 16 years old, still wearing the off-white blouse she had changed into the night before when she dressed for dinner. The grass around her was flattened, Branches nearby were snapped at the base. The ground itself had been disturbed, pressed down in the way ground gets when something desperate happens on top of it. Dr. Huey reached for the phone. His hands were shaking. Within minutes, Chambers Road transformed, radios crackled, tires crunched on gravel. Trooper Jan Wushner arrived first, then detectives from the Walton Post, their headlights cutting through the morning as they pulled in one after another. The quiet country road was suddenly full of people moving fast and speaking low, the way people speak when they already know something terrible is true, and they're just confirming the details. The details were worse than they expected. Investigators soon determined that Carol's life had been taken in a very personal, close-contact manner, using an object she had been wearing that very evening. That single fact changes the nature of what happened. This was not a quick or distant act of violence. This was close, personal. The killer had been right there. The medical examiner's report revealed the sheer intensity of the attack. It wasn't just a random act of violence. The evidence suggested a deep, unsettling level of aggression that no one could explain. Carol did not fight back. One account suggests she never had the chance. The scene also showed evidence of a severe struggle and further physical violation. And then she had been driven 17 miles from home and left beside a drainage pipe on a road nobody used much. 17 miles from home. 1.5 miles from where her killer would sleep that night. Among the plastic bags collected from that scene were two things nobody fully understood the value of yet: DNA material and fingerprints. Detective Jerry Keith was assigned the case. Kentucky State Police. Quiet, thorough, the kind of investigator who treated every overlooked detail like it might be the one that mattered. He didn't know it yet, but what he was holding, what he carefully sealed and labeled and stored, was the entire solution to this crime. He just didn't have the world yet that could read it. In 1976, using biological material from a crime scene to identify an unknown suspect wasn't possible. DNA profiling as a forensic tool didn't exist yet in any form law enforcement could access. Keith was working like a man trying to read a book in a language that hadn't been invented. The evidence was there, the answer was there, locked inside something invisible, waiting for a science that was still decades away. He preserved it anyway. He logged it, stored it, treated it like gold even when he had no way of knowing that's exactly what it was. That decision, quiet, unglamorous, made in a moment no one was watching, is the reason this story eventually has an ending. Keith didn't save the case by solving it. He saved it by refusing to throw anything away. Witnesses came forward. A neighbor described the previous evening. A light-colored car, a Chevrolet Monte Carlo, or possibly a Pontiac Grand Prix. A young man, tall, slim, sandy blonde hair. Carol had gotten in willingly. That detail mattered more than people realized. She had trusted him. Keith chased the car, chased the description, ran down every registered Monte Carlo and Grand Prix in the area, knocked on doors, pulled records, built a list of names that grew and shrank and grew again as leads came in and fell apart. The sandy-haired man stayed a ghost, seen by multiple witnesses in broad daylight, described clearly and completely, utterly unreachable. The case went cold, not because Keith quit, he never quit, but the evidence had taken him as far as 1976 could take him, and 1976 had run out of road. At some point during those first terrible days, someone called Thomas Klaber. He was 23 years old. He came to the morgue. The room was cold, deliberately, mechanically cold. Fluorescent lights overhead, the low hum of refrigeration units along the walls, the smell underneath everything of something chemical, something that tried to be neutral and wasn't. Thomas walked in, and the sound of his own footsteps on that floor was probably the loudest thing he had ever heard. They showed him his sister. He confirmed what they needed him to confirm. And then he left that building carrying something he would never put down. Not in a year, not in 10 years, not in 46. The image of Carol on that table, in that light, in that cold, that became part of him in a way nothing ever undoes. Their parents wrote about it later. No dramatic language, just the plain words of people who had been broken and were trying to explain it simply. The next night on the news, we heard that the body of a young girl was found in a ditch in Boone County. We called the Kentucky State Police. It was our daughter. They found out from the news, a television report, a ditch in Boone County, and then a phone call to a number they hoped would tell them they were wrong. It didn't. Keith worked the case for nearly a decade. He never closed the file. He carried it with him even after retirement, physically carried a copy of the case report, according to those who knew him. As if letting go of the paper meant letting go of Carol. He never let go. But the man who had killed her was already gone. He had watched the same news reports, read the same newspapers. In his own description, sandy blonde hair, tall, slim, light-colored Monte Carlo, printed in black and white for all of Boone County to read. And on June 14, 1976, just 10 days after Carol Clayber got into his car for the last time, he walked into an Army recruiting office. He picked up a pen, he signed his name, and he disappeared into a system so large that no one in Fort Wright, Kentucky would be able to find him for decades. Park Hills, Kentucky, a quiet neighborhood, residential streets. Kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and waved to each other from driveways. Thomas William Dunaway lived here, 1.5 miles from Carol Clayber's front door. Half a mile from Davu Park, where Carol rode her bike, where she talked to strangers, where she was last seen alive getting into a light-colored Monte Carlo, his Monte Carlo. While Detective Keith was photographing a crime scene 17 miles away, while Carol's family was waiting for a daughter who would never walk back through the door, Dunaway was right here. Close enough that he could have walked to her house in 30 minutes. Close enough that he probably knew exactly which streets she used. Close enough that the word neighbor almost applies. That proximity is not a coincidence. It is the entire explanation for how this happened. June 7, 1976, 3 days after Carol's murder, the Kentucky Post ran the story. And inside that article was something that should have ended everything, a description of the suspect. Sandy blonde hair, tall, slim, and the car, a light-colored Chevrolet Monte Carlo or Pontiac Grand Prix. Dunaway read it. We know he read it because of what he did next. Most people, when they see their own description in a murder investigation, panic. They make mistakes. They talk to someone they shouldn't. They act in ways that draw attention. Dunaway did none of that. He sat with it. He calculated. And then, on June 14, 1976, 7 days after that newspaper hit doorsteps across Boone County, Thomas Dunaway walked into a United States Army recruiting office and signed his name. 10 days after Carol Clayber was found dead on Chambers Road, he was 19 years old. He owned a 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo that matched the description in the paper. He lived half a mile from where she was last seen, and his solution to all of that was not to run, not to hide, not to confess. It was to disappear into the one system large enough to make a person invisible, the United States military. That is not panic. That is a 19-year-old boy thinking 3 steps ahead. August 12, 1976, Fort Knox, Kentucky. Dunaway graduated basic training. August 24th, he reported for duty at Fort Carson, Colorado, 1,000 miles from Boone County, 1,000 miles from Chambers Road, 1,000 miles from the evidence sitting in storage that nobody could read yet. From the outside, it looked like he had done it, gotten away clean, left everything behind. Started over in a uniform with a new address and a built-in alibi for the rest of his life. But here is what Dunaway could not escape: himself. December 3, 1976, Dunaway was reported AWOL from Fort Carson. He came back to Kentucky. Nobody knows exactly what pulled him back. Maybe he thought enough time had passed. Maybe he believed the investigation had gone cold, and he was right about that, it had. Maybe he simply could not stay away. Whatever the reason, 6 months after murdering Carol Clayber, Thomas Dunaway was back in northern Kentucky, and within 2 weeks, someone else was dead. December 17, 1976, Ronald Townsend, 19 years old, the same age as Dunaway, tragically lost his life in a violent encounter just 2 weeks later. A young man who had nothing to do with Carol Clayber, nothing to do with the summer of 1976, nothing to do with any of it, except that he crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong moment. Townsend survived for 4 days. December 21st, he was gone. Dunaway didn't disappear this time. He went on a run instead, burning a car, moving through states, carrying an illegal sawed-off shotgun, the kind of behavior that looks less like a man trying to escape and more like a man who had stopped caring whether he got caught. Christmas Eve, 1976. South Carolina. Authorities arrested him. Not for Carol, not for Townsend yet, but for arson and illegal possession of a firearm. The walls were closing in on a different timeline than justice required. Eventually, the Townsend murder caught up to him. Dunaway confessed. He was convicted, sentenced to life in prison. And here is where the story turns in a way that is hard to sit with. Life in prison in this case meant 7.5 years. He was released in December 1984, back on the streets, free, breathing, while Carol's family was still waiting for answers. While Detective Keith was still carrying that file. while the evidence in storage was still waiting for a science that didn't exist yet. 7.5 years for a murder, for Ronald Townsend's murder. And Carol's. The crime that started all of it wasn't even part of the sentence because nobody had connected him to it yet. The system caught Dunaway, but it caught him for the wrong crime, held him for the wrong amount of time, and let him go. After 1984, Dunaway lived the rest of his life outside those walls. 6 years passed. December 28, 1990, Thomas William Dunaway died of a heart attack. He was 33 years old. And every secret he carried, every detail of what happened to Carol Clayber on the evening of June 4, 1976, went into the ground with him. Just like that, the killer was gone. No confession, no courtroom. No moment where he had to look at Thomas Clayber and answer for what he had taken from that family. He simply stopped breathing one December morning, and the case, already cold, became something that felt permanent, unsolvable, finished. Carol's parents would spend the rest of their lives without knowing his name. Her mother died without knowing. Her brother, the other one, not Thomas, died without knowing. The answer was buried in a grave, and the question was still sitting open on a detective's desk in Kentucky. But Detective Jerry Keith had not thrown away a single piece of evidence. Not the DNA, not the fingerprints, not the files, not the descriptions, not one page of the case that had consumed nearly a decade of his professional life, and every year after that. He retired, he got older, and he still carried the file. Because Keith understood something that the system had failed to act on, that Carol Clayber's story was not finished just because the killer had died. The evidence was still there. The truth was still there, locked inside technology that the world hadn't built yet. He just needed someone to keep believing that long enough. People who knew Keith described a man who carried Carol Clayber's case the way some people carry old photographs, not because they planned to, but because putting it down was never really an option. He had been there at the beginning. He had seen the evidence. He had worked the leads until the leads ran out. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where unfinished things live, Carol's case never closed. Then, in 2017, Boone County established its first cold case unit. 2 detectives were assigned to it, Toy Cox and Tim Adams. One of the first things they did was go find Jerry Keith. What that meeting looked like, only the people in the room know. But consider what Keith was handing over: 40 years of weight. A file he had carried through retirement, through the years, through the slow accumulation of time that turns an active investigation into a cold case, and a cold case into something people stop expecting to be solved. He gave them everything. And Cox and Adams took it, not as a formality, not as a box to check, but as a promise. Keith had kept Carol's case alive through sheer refusal to let it die. Now it was their turn. They started where Keith had left off. 2 suspects, 2 names Keith had never been able to fully rule out, 2 threads that had never been cleanly cut. The first suspect was a man from northern Indiana. He had stolen a car that matched the description witnesses gave, a light-colored Monte Carlo-type vehicle. The timeline put him in the area. On paper, the pieces fit in a way that felt significant. Cox and Adams tracked him down. They sat across from him, and the man did something unexpected. He cooperated completely. He didn't lawyer up. He didn't deflect. He looked at them and said, quietly and directly, "I've done a lot of things in my life. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I did not kill Carol Sue Klaber." Then he said something that stayed with Cox. "When you find out I didn't do it, call me back and tell me." It was the kind of thing an innocent man says. Cox collected his DNA. The results came back in December 2018. Negative, not a match. Cox called him back. He had promised he would. The man on the other end of the line said he was shocked they actually followed through. 1 thread cut, 1 dead end confirmed, and the file still open. The second suspect felt more promising, more disturbing. Michael Dean Tate, 77 years old in 2020. He had lived in Georgia for years, but traveled to the Boone County area frequently for work throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the exact window that mattered. On October 1, 1978, just 2 years after Carol's murder, Tate had attacked a woman in her own garage in Park Hills. 2 hours. He burned her with cigarettes. He left her broken but alive. And when investigators found him decades later, he admitted to it. He confessed to the 1978 assault without much resistance. But Carol's murder, he denied it. Completely, consistently. Cox had him. The geography fit. The timing fit. The pattern of violence fit. This felt like the end of the road, the moment the case finally closed. The DNA came back. No match. Court records confirmed Tate had been in Cincinnati in 1976, not in Boone County. not near Devil Park, not near a light-colored Monte Carlo. Cox sat with that result. 2 suspects, 2 negatives, 46 years of open file, and a piece of evidence, a single hair collected from Carol's body in 1976, its DNA finally extracted by the Kentucky State Police Lab in 2019, that held the answer to everything and still had no name attached to it. September 2022. Cox contacted Othram Labs in Houston, Texas. Othram is not a standard forensics lab. They operate at the intersection of molecular biology and population genetics, built specifically for the cases that traditional DNA testing cannot solve. The cases where there is no suspect to compare against, where the only option is to build a genetic map from scratch and let the science find the family tree. Funding came from Season of Justice, a nonprofit that exists for exactly this purpose: families and agencies who have run out of options, cases that deserve one more chance. The Kentucky State Police Central Forensic Center sent Othram a DNA extract developed from that 1976 crime scene, a single hair, decades old. The kind of evidence most labs would look at and say, there is not enough here. Othram scientists used what they call forensic-grade genome sequencing. They built a complete DNA profile from that hair, not a partial profile, not a rough sketch, a comprehensive, detailed genetic blueprint of the man who had been in that car with Carol Clayber on June 4, 1976. Then Othram's genealogy team went to work. They searched, they cross-referenced. They mapped family connections across generations, the way a family tree branches outward and backward at the same time. They were not looking for the killer directly, they were looking for his relatives, his cousins, his children. Anyone whose DNA, uploaded to a genealogy database somewhere, might connect back to the profile they had built, and they found the connection. January 23, 2023, Othram called the Boone County Sheriff's Office. The message was simple, direct: we believe we have your guy. You need to contact this family. The name they gave Cox was Thomas William Dunaway, dead since 1990, buried, gone. But Cox wasn't finished, because Dunaway had left something behind: a daughter, a grown woman who had never had a relationship with her father, who had grown up without knowing who he really was, what he had done, what he was capable of, who had built her entire life in the shadow of an absence she couldn't explain. Cox and Adams found her in February 2023. They explained what they needed and why. She agreed to give her DNA. The results came back. Cox looked at the number on that report: 100%. Parent-child match. The DNA from the hair collected off Carol Clayber's body in 1976 and the DNA from Thomas Dunaway's daughter. They pointed to the same man, unmistakably, irrefutably, with a certainty that 46 years of investigation had never been able to produce before. The ghost had a name. The name had always been Dunaway, and he had been dead for 33 years. March 8, 2023, Boone County Sheriff's Office. A room full of reporters, cameras, and people who had waited a very long time for this morning. Sheriff Michael Helmig stood at the podium, Major Philip Ridgell beside him, and Detective Coy Cox, the man who had spent 6 years chasing a ghost, standing in a room where that ghost was finally about to get a name. 46 years of open file, 46 years of unanswered questions, 46 years of a family waiting for a phone call that kept not coming. It ended here. Major Ridgell spoke first. We can announce today that the killer's name is Thomas Dunaway, originally of Park Hills, Kentucky. At the time of the murder, he was 19 years old. Over the years, he established quite a lengthy and violent criminal history. The name landed in that room like something heavy being set down after a very long carry. Thomas W. Dunaway, dead since 1990. The man who had lived 1.5 miles from Carol Clayber, who had read his own description in the newspaper and signed his name in an Army recruiting office 10 days later, who had killed again 6 months after Carol and served 7.5 years for it, who had died of a heart attack at 33 and taken his secret underground. His name was out now, in the light, in the record, attached permanently to what he had done. There would be no trial. The law does not prosecute the dead. No courtroom, no verdict read aloud, no moment where Dunaway had to stand up and face what he had taken. But Boone County Commonwealth's attorney Lewis Kelly wrote a letter, and that letter said something that mattered. I want to state unequivocally, if Thomas Dunaway were still alive, I believe sufficient evidence now exists to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he murdered Carol Sue Klaber. But for his death, My office would be presenting this case to the grand jury. Read that again slowly. Beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest legal standard that exists, the bar a jury would need to clear to convict. And the Commonwealth Attorney of Boone County was saying, we cleared it. The evidence is there. The science confirmed it. The case is built. Dunaway simply ran out of time before justice could reach him. That letter was not a consolation prize. It was a declaration. A formal, legal, on-the-record statement that Carol Clayber was murdered, that the man responsible has been identified, and that the system, even 46 years late, saw it clearly. It was the closest thing to a verdict Carol was ever going to get, and it was enough to close the case. Before the press conference, before the cameras, before the public announcement, Cox went to see Thomas Clayber. He sat down across from the man who had walked into a morgue at 23 years old and identified his little sister on a cold metal table. The man who had carried that image for 46 years. The man whose mother had died without knowing, whose other brother had died without knowing. Who was the last one left, the only surviving thread connecting the world to Carol Sue Klaber? Cox told him everything, the name, the details. How close Dunaway had lived, how he had read the newspaper, how the hair, one single hair preserved in an evidence bag since 1976, had finally spoken. And Thomas Clayber, who had spent 46 years bracing for another loss, who had called his own son late at night just to hear his voice and confirm he was still there, who had lived inside a fear that never fully let go. Thomas Clayber exhaled. Cox described it simply because simple is the only language that fits a moment like that. You could physically just see his body relax, and he said, I already feel so much closure. 46 years of tension leaving a man's body in one breath. That is what a name can do. There was one more thing, one final act of justice that arrived quietly, without cameras, to enter Dunaway's DNA into the FBI's national database, CODIS, and check whether he was connected to any other unsolved crimes. Detectives needed a direct sample from his body. The law required it, which meant an exhumation. They obtained the court order. They dug up Thomas Dunaway. And Carol Clayber's grave was never touched. Thomas said it himself when he heard, there is a little bit of justice. You're going to disturb somebody's remains. Dig him up. And they did. For 46 years, Carol had rested undisturbed while her killer walked free. Now her killer was the one being pulled from the ground, examined, entered into a database, held accountable in the only way the living could still hold him. Carol's case was officially removed from the Boone County cold case list that same week. The list still exists. Other names remain on it. Other families are still waiting. But Carol Clayber's name is gone from it now, not because the case was abandoned, not because time ran out, but because two detectives refused to stop a scientist preserved one hair in 1976 without knowing why, and a laboratory in Houston built a genetic map from something most people would have thrown away. But here is what I need you to remember before this ends. This was never really a story about DNA, or cold case units, or forensic genealogy, or a killer who thought he had gotten away. This was a story about a girl from Fort Wright, Kentucky, a girl who started learning piano at 5 years old, who stood on a real stage at the Taft Museum at 8 and played for an audience who recognized something special in her, who picked up the violin and then the guitar because music was not just something she did, it was something she was, who walked into a nursing home on her own time and sat with people who needed company, because that is the kind of person she was. She was funny, she was warm, she was 16 years old and about to start her senior year, and her whole life was in front of her like a long open road. And somewhere in the world right now, there is a room that got quieter when Carol Clayber left it. There is a laugh that stopped in 1976 and never came back. There is a violin that never got to finish its song. She deserved all of it, every note, every year, every room she would have walked into and made better just by being there. Her name was Carol Sue Klaber, and now, finally, the world knows who took her. Before you go, I want to ask you 3 things, and I genuinely want to know what you think. First, Detective Jerry Keith carried this file for decades, even after retirement, and never gave up. Do you think cases like Carol's would ever get solved without that kind of personal obsession from one investigator? Second, Dunaway served only 7.5 years for Ronald Townsend's murder and walked free in 1984. If the justice system had kept him longer, Carol's case might have been solved while he was still alive. Does that feel like justice to you, or does it feel like a system failure? And third, A single hair, preserved in 1976, solved this case in 2023. Forensic technology is now solving crimes that were considered impossible. Are there other cold cases you think deserve this same chance? Drop your thoughts below. Carol's story deserves to be heard, and so does yours.